I'm going to hand over to our pensions rep, Mark Taylor-Batty, and can we welcome Sam Marsh, who's come over from Sheffield as well. As you will know from the email and from times that you've met him before, if you've been to one of our meetings before, is one of the national negotiators on USS for UCU, so you've got a real inside view of what's going on at the moment and what we can expect in the coming weeks and months. So we'll kick off and I'll go.
All right, thank you, Vicky. Would it be useful if I give a summary of where we are, how we got to where we are today? So just to remind people of what we've been through, I've got a couple of things here. Just to take us through the history of the dispute leading to where we are today. So we started in July 2017 with USS reporting a technical deficit at that time of around 17.5 million. As you know from previous meetings, this is not money that is missing. This is just a projection of future liabilities against future assets. Winter that year, the employers came together and had a consensus that to respond to the deficit, they would shift up our pension benefits from a defined benefits plus system that we had, where we knew what the pension would be that we got in retirement, to a defined contribution only system where all that we would know is what we would pay in from that point onwards. January 2018, the Joint Negotiating Committee, which is made up of elected members of UCU and UUK, who represent the universities, they agreed, in inverted commas, the defined contribution proposal going forward to put back to USS. I say agreed because it was the casting vote of the chair who came to that conclusion. So Sam Marsh is now a member of that Joint Negotiating Committee. You remember on the back of that we then had that significant strike action about a year ago, and on the 13th of March we rejected, all the branches around the country rejected the ACAS brokered solution that UCU and UK had put together the day before. Remember, those of you that were out on the strike, we came together at the Quakers Meeting House and solidly rejected that here at Leeds, and that was repeated around the country. Later on, we voted nationally to call off strike action, accept an updated model keeping the status quo until this point. That is to say, contributions and benefits remain the same, but on the condition that a joint expert panel was set up to consider the valuation and issues of governance, and we've heard one recommendation from them. So in August, the USS announced a cost-sharing arrangement so that the benefit status quo could be maintained after that point if no agreement reached, and we've heard of those. So we know the first one of those is now happening this month, the 8.8% contribution, up from 8% now. Then a month later, the Joint Expert Panel, the JEP, released its first report, which very much validated much of UCU arguments to date around issues of the valuation, and it recommended a new approach to the valuation as a means of bringing the dispute to an end. A month later, maybe just a few days before making a recommendation to the JEP, Sam here presented a very significant challenge to the misapplication of one of the tests that the USS were using to construct that deficit. I use the word construct advisedly, to make up that deficit. Test one, we can't go into the details of test one, you will have heard it over and over again, but it was this measure that they were using, the consequences of which were this valuation, this deficit. Sam put in a very serious challenge to that around about that time. In November, the UUK employers came to a consensus and agreed to the JEP findings. And in December, the USS scheme proposed to replace the 2017 valuation with the 2018 valuation as a means of trying to come to some conclusion. In December that year, at the JNC, the USS conceded that if they followed the JEP recommendations completely, there would be no detriment. There would be no need to change contributions and the benefits would stay the same. But nonetheless, they were pushing for change within their process nonetheless. And now, March last month, the UUK consulted the institutions on a response to the 2018 valuation that the USS had constructed, and these result in a consensus around employers paying contingency contributions. That's basically if the circumstances become extreme and more money is needed, the employers would pay those in. Although there is some discussion around whether we too, employees, should also pay those. I don't think that matter has been resolved. So that's really just a very, very potted history of the last year and a little bit more of how we come to be where we are now. And Sam has been very much at the centre of much of that, and indeed we had him broadcast to us at the last meeting that we had, if you remember, those of you that came. Sam was talking over a video link. So really all we need to do really is talk about where we are now and accept some questions from the floor and respond to them. So Sam, if you'd like to join me, and if you'd like to sort of give us some thoughts on where you think the main tensions are now and where we're going in the next months.
Thanks, Mark. That's a thorough whistle-stop tour of what's happened over the last year or so, or in fact going back further than that. And it's the situation as it currently is really pretty unclear right now, because there are so many strands all going on at once. So one of them is, as Mark said, USS's insistence that they will finalise the 2017 valuation as it was, basically as it was December 2017, before we went on strike. They're saying, well, we'll just put that one in as it was, and that's the thing that's being dealt with these cost-sharing increases that mean that this month our contributions go up to 8.8%. In October, if nothing else changes, they go up again to something higher. No, brilliant, thank you. 10.4 by the looks of it, yeah. And then again the following April, if still nothing's changed, they'll go up to 11.7%. We'll keep the same benefits, but at the same time employers will be paying a lot more. So 19.5% starting from this month, 22.5% in October, and then 24.9% in a year's time. So USS is insisting it needs to go through that process, finish off that valuation which was the source of all the strike and strife, and if nothing else changes, that's what's happening. But as Mark said, they've at the same time said it's okay, we may not ever see those October increases because we're going to launch another valuation dated a year later, so a March 2018 valuation, which can use updated figures, updated investment growth, updated forecasts and stuff like that. And crucially, could, if it wanted to, take into account the recommendations from the Joint Expert Panel. Right, so I've been on the Joint Negotiating Committee since the summer, and we were first shown in around October time what the valuation would look like if they employed all of the Joint Expert Panel recommendations. And this was kind of a teaser, if you like, almost a way of tempting us and Universities UK into saying, okay, we'll proceed on that basis. We'll let you finalise the 2017 valuation as long as we swiftly follow it with the 2018 one. And given how that looks when you apply the Joint Expert Panel recommendations to it, we'll proceed on that basis. And as Mark said, applying all the Joint Expert Panel recommendations gets you to a situation where the same benefits are kept for, in fact, a slightly lower contribution rate than we currently pay, 25.5% instead of 26% total. So that's the 8 plus 18 on the screen that we paid until this month. Not only that, but this surplus deficit situation, well, if you apply all the Joint Expert Panel recommendations to the 2018 numbers, you get a very small surplus, 0.6 billion. Well, I mean, that's a small surplus in the scheme of things. I mean, compared to the 17.5 million that we almost were talking about, I mean, that's 600 million. I mean, it's a lot of money, but still, it would be a surplus. So, we, along with Universities UK, agreed to going down that route to a 2018 valuation. Technically, we didn't have a formal say in it, it was up to the trustee board, but we said, okay, we're prepared to proceed on this basis. Although it should be said that neither us nor Universities UK trusted USS not to pull some kind of trick on us. I know I'm being recorded, but I'm happy to say that publicly because, well, I think I say it to Bill Gavin's face from time to time. Anyway, so what was the trick? Well, the trick was, as soon as there was an agreement that we'd proceed on this basis with the 2018 valuation, USS's executive recommended to the board that 2 of the main recommendations from the Joint Expert Panel be dropped, so that they wouldn't be included in the valuation. Because of that, we're now looking at a 2018 valuation that in the worst case is almost as bad as the 2017 valuation. It would basically be a case of a bit of updating for what's happened to the investments over the past year, but not much else. I think the total will come down a small amount to 33.7-ish, which I can't remember exactly what the numbers on the screen show, but that's more like 37 or something. 36.7, 6.6? Can't do it in my head while I'm talking. I can do it if I stop. Don't worry, I'm good at maths. I can't talk and think and do maths at the same time. So yeah, the worst case scenario from here, and it's a definite possibility, is that the trustee board will decide to proceed basically ignoring the whole of the joint expert panel and ask for 33.7% for the same benefits. Now, we thought we'd know by now what the trustee board decided, but they had a meeting a week ago, and I think it's possibly a good sign that the board couldn't come to a decision at that meeting. So the trustee board of USS has 3 representatives nominated by UCU. We can't actually tell them what to do on the board. We get to nominate them, and then we're supposed to be relatively hands-off, although we do talk to them a fair bit. It has 4 representatives sent by the employers, and then 5 independents. And that's the board that has to make the decision on the valuation, including on whether to incorporate the joint expert panel's recommendations. So that was the board that a week ago was supposed to come to a decision, a final decision on what the valuation would look like, and didn't. Now we haven't heard much from the board, only an update from the Chief Executive, Bill Galvin, who spoke to us on the Joint Negotiating Committee last week. But we think it's possibly more positive than not that there wasn't agreement there. Now the other layer to all this, so that's 2 layers of what's going on. The other layer has also been alluded to by Mark, which is this thing about contingent contributions. Now this is a totally new layer added on top of the current valuation, which is that USS have told the employers we may be able to drop this rate down from 33.7 to something significantly lower, below 30%, if you agree to what they're calling trigger contributions, which is some system by which USS can just point at a number, snap their fingers, and contributions go up. Now that number is based on kind of market-derived figures and stuff. We're not keen on it at all. The employers aren't keen on it at all. USS are close to insisting that this has to be there. Although again, that could have been some of the disagreement at the board last week and the reason why we haven't heard a final decision. Now those trigger contributions are going to be, if they are insisted on by USS, are going to be another flashpoint in this whole story, because if those trigger contributions are implemented and the employers agree to them, they currently say, well, we want to share those increases with you if and when they come about. Now, given we've been cut out of most of the discussions around what those trigger contributions should be, what they should look like, how they should, the parameters that come into them, given that we can rightly expect the joint expert panel's recommendations to be followed, given that there was historic underpayment by employers between 1997 and 2011, where they paid below the rate that was advised because there was a surplus in the scheme that they wanted to run down, and given various other similar strong arguments, which I won't go through now, it doesn't seem at all right that we should be sucked into this talk of these snap your fingers and pay more trigger contributions. So there's an awful lot that's uncertain. We should find out more over the next month or so. The board is reconvened at the end of April to make this final decision on the valuation and the final decision on trigger contributions. At that point, it will become clear where we are, and I guess you could broadly categorise it in three scenarios, one of which is almost, well, it's kind of a dream scenario that I don't expect the USS executive to let happen, but let me go through them anyway. So the first one is the trustee board decides that this trigger contribution thing's a non-starter and that they will ask for 33.7% for the benefits we currently have, in which case I would imagine UCU will be balloting for strike action straight away. And we're basically right back to the start of the dispute, except with the employers also solidly saying the same kinds of things as we are. So how that situation would pan out, it really isn't clear, but I think all the pressure in that situation would turn on USS, and I think it would be very unlikely that a lot of the key players at USS would survive not physically, but survive in their roles in that situation. But that is a definite possibility, and they may not be aware just how bad a decision that would be. Probably the most likely outcome is that USS say, okay, you can have these benefits for around 29 point something % total. So that would mean us paying 9 point something and employers paying the rest. If you agree to these trigger contributions, at that point, employers will say, okay, we'll agree to those as long as UCU agree to their share. And my guess is, although this is a question that would then lead to lots of discussion with members, possibly balloting on what people wanted to do, but my guess is UCU's response would be, you take all the contributions and we'll call it quits. And how that would pan out is not totally clear. Although Mark's talked about the chair's casting vote at the Joint Negotiating Committee, that could come into play here because it may not need to get as far as any kind of dispute with employers. The Joint Negotiating Committee may be able to sort that out. Disagreement between us and Universities UK, we'd have a good chance, I would hope, of persuading the chair to back our position, at which point employers would feel the same thing that we felt when the chair voted against us. The final situation is the dream scenario, which I don't expect to happen, which is that USS go back on everything they've said and said, actually, you're right, the Joint Expert Panel had it right, you don't need to pay more, or you only need to pay the rate that the Joint Expert Panel said you needed to pay, and forget about trigger contributions, we were barking up the wrong tree. If that came out of the trustee board, then we really are home and dry for this valuation. But that's kind of a dream scenario, and knowing the personalities of those involved at USS, it would take a miracle for that to come about, I think. Or strike action. So, there's a summary of where we are. That middle option of those three is the one that I think is most likely to happen, and I would guess that could potentially lead to some kind of at least temporary settlement to the dispute, as long as we weren't forced to pay trigger contributions, but that is up to the membership. The negotiators, we go in and we try our best to get as much as we can through talking, and then at the end of it we say, that's as far as we've got through talking, what do you think? Which you saw go wrong with the ACAS settlement. I wasn't on the negotiating committee back then, of course, I should just like to make that clear. But you can see how such a thing happens, because, I mean, apart from the fact that it seemed that UCU were quite enthusiastically signed up to that proposal, or at least some of the people in UCU were, there is only so much you can do through negotiation, and the rest is down to what the membership want to happen next. Right, I've talked for too long, I didn't have any slides, but yeah, we should have some questions, I guess, Marsh.
Yeah, before we go to questions, can I just ask you to talk a little bit about, we hear repeatedly about the pensions regulator putting on pressures to force USS hand. Although more recently we've heard that USS possibly misrepresented the pension regulator. Where are they within this at the moment now, do you think?
Right, pensions regulator, it's starting to become clear what their game, if you'd call it that, is, which is they're very happy to see USS come out with a very sort of prudent, pessimistic valuation that ramps up costs. They don't seem to be prepared to publicly be the people that are insisting that they do that. So they seem to be playing a game whereby they will write letters which kind of encourage a sort of prudent approach, say things like that this is at the limit of acceptability and stuff like that, but they're never prepared to explicitly write down where this limit is, and in fact have recently, as Mark said, made a public statement that contradicted some of the things that USS had told us about how far they can go with the valuation, saying that they don't ever have a hard limit to how prudent this valuation has to be, which USS had told us they did. So yeah, the pensions regulator is an interesting case. We haven't, since I've been on the negotiating committee, we haven't met with the pensions regulator, although at one of the most recent meetings it was suggested that should happen, so hopefully it will. I do know that the employers met with the pensions regulator recently, and the pensions regulator refrained from giving too much opinion, which is kind of interesting. And then, of course, there's a link between USS and the pensions regulator, which is Bill Galvin, the chief executive of USS, previously was chief executive of the pensions regulator before he came to USS. And clearly, if I don't know how close the link is between Bill and the pensions regulator now, but clearly his mindset is still very much a regulator's mindset, which possibly isn't helpful in the circumstances.
Thank you, that's useful. Okay, I can put our glossary back up for those that might want to refer to it. Are there any questions about the situation as we stand? Go back there.
Every 3 years there's a valuation which decides whether there's a deficit or not and sets the future rate. So the outcome of the 2018 valuation will be some kind of deficit or surplus. Most likely they're going to claim a deficit of about 4 billion and a rate for the future of, well, let's hope it's 29 point something plus trigger contributions. Well, in fact, let's hope it's 26% and nothing changes, but at the worst case, let's hope it's 29 point something and trigger contributions. Now, if that's what they go with, what that means is that we start paying 29 point something in total between us, and then USS monitor month by month the deficit. Now, the way they do that is relatively suspect. They do it, at the moment they do it on a kind of what they call a gilts plus basis, which those who've been following will know it's not a great way to value a pension fund. But nonetheless, they say it gives them a kind of monitoring basis for how the scheme's doing over the intervening time. So these trigger contributions are things that will kick in if that deficit drops below a certain amount. Now, the most recent documents that have been discussing what these things could look like, say 10 billion or something. So and it would have to stay below 10 billion for 3 months or something like that.
The deficit being above that.
Oh, sorry, stay, but worse than 10 billion. So deficit above, yes, right. So I'm thinking it was minus 10, and you've got to go below. Yeah, sorry. So anyway, a worse deficit than 10 billion sustained for a period of 3 months or so. If that happens, they would then increase contributions by 1%, 1.5%, 2% in total, which would then be picked up by either just the employers, or if the employers get their way, employers and us split in a 65-35 ratio. Now, those higher contributions would persist until the deficit went back above a certain amount. It might not be 10 billion, I forget. I think it's kind of 10 billion to trigger on the way down and then something else on the way up or something. I forget. In the worst case scenario, and the deficit stays below 10 billion, a year later they might ratchet up again, and a year later they'd ratchet up again by these steps. So that's what these trigger contributions are about. Employers are pretty hard set against them, so they're not convinced about these things. But they are prepared at the moment to play along, and so the current proposal that's been discussed by the board is one that actually came from the employers. So another layer to the story, which was that USS said, you're going to have to agree to trigger contributions if you want a rate low enough to not get into dispute with UCU, and we're going to tell you what those things look like. And then in January, it became clear that USS couldn't agree what those things would look like, and changed the story to, you're going to have to, the rate is now 33.7%, if you want it lower, you tell us what you're prepared to do for trigger contributions. Which was they turned on a pinhead after a difficult board meeting where no agreement was reached. So UUK, they're on the board somewhere. UUK have or are playing the game and did come up with a trigger contribution proposal which they sent to USS. But I think my guess is this is the last roll of the dice from UUK, and if USS sort of turn it down or try and ramp it back up and say, no, what you've proposed is too light, we want heavier contributions than that, then I would expect that UUK stop playing and start agitating in a similar way to UCU. That's my hope. To an extent, yes. I mean, they wrote down 11 proposals for what these trigger contributions would be. Right, this is USS. They wrote down, one of those was objectivity, and they tried to claim that. So they, I mean, on the one hand, it sounds sensible. They said whatever the metric is that's used to trigger these contributions, it needs to be objective and agreed. You know, so that there's no dispute over whether this thing's been crossed. Unfortunately, objective in the world of financial economics means market derived, and then we get to these gilts plus things. Yeah, so I mean, the truth is that the proposal that's come from Universities UK on trigger contributions is about as sensible as you could get in terms of. So there's a really well-written paper by their actuarial advisors, Aon, which spells out how this thing would work. And if you were going to do such a thing, it's about as sensible as it would get. But almost certainly, the USS executive want the board to reject this thing, because that's how Bill Galvin and his team work. The hope is that the trustee board is reasonable enough to not just go with what they're told by their advisors. Yeah, but no, it's close to extortion, because pension funds kind of 3-year triennial valuations are the kind of the way to check on the health of a fund. Anything quicker is a kind of, you know, a quick test to see how things are going. You can easily make the wrong judgment. You can make the wrong judgment at a triennial valuation. You can easily make it over the course of a few months. So I mean, we discussed it at the Joint Negotiating Committee, and when we called this out as sort of intellectually bankrupt, because it is, and I mean, it's one of these situations where you don't deal with a volatile thing, which the way they measure the deficit is volatile, it goes up and down all over the place. You don't respond to a volatile thing by measuring it more quickly. I mean, that's obvious. You smooth and you wait longer times. You don't make short-term snap judgments. So we called it out as intellectually bankrupt, but we haven't formally been involved in any of the consultations on the trigger contributions. That's been a discussion between USS and UUK, which I think is a strong argument why we should not be having to pay for any of it, given that we haven't been allowed to be part of the discussions.
So just to be clear, we don't yet know if these trigger contributions are going to happen.
No.
It's a likely outcome, perhaps.
Probably the most likely outcome,
Yeah.
but it's not at all certain.
But even whether it happens or not, we don't yet know whether we will be asked to pay them as well. Although that also is a likely desire of the employers.
That's what the employers have said. In fact, they've kind of said that the setup that they had for these things, the proposal that they had, was based on them being split, and they're making no promises that they'll still back them if we refuse to split them with them. But to be honest, I mean the expected cost, the way it's being set up, the proposal that's being discussed at the moment, the way it's set up, the probability of any rise in contributions over the 3-year period is about 30%. So there's kind of a slightly less than a 1 in 3 chance that there would be any increase. There's a very small chance that there would be an increase each year, about sort of 2% or something. But that's based on forecasts that, I mean, yeah, who knows whether those forecasts are right, but still, as such things go, the one that's on the table isn't terrible, but we shouldn't be paying it. That's my view. That's right, and I mean things like, you know, you want to know if global warming's happening, you start to get a picture over a number of years. Same time, once that's taken into account with all the other evidence, you know, you start to spot a pattern. But these patterns are slow developing and should be reacted to sort of slowly. Yeah, absolutely. You don't make decisions on today's weather. Yeah, nice analogy.
Yeah, and then over there.
I was just going to make a comment that
Yeah. Yeah, no, I mean, it's a fair point, and we've been saying to Universities UK, we totally oppose these things, and we're with you as far as you want to go in opposing them. It's UK who are essentially saying we're prepared to try this relatively benign proposal as a kind of last roll of the dice, because I mean, the thing that's become clear. People running universities aren't activists in any sense. I mean, that perhaps should be obvious, but it's kind of interesting to see. We'll have informal meetings with Universities UK where we'll see how angry they are with what's going on at USS, and then the letter they'll write to USS about this is very politely worded. It's kind of interesting, the difference of approach. UCU straight away called for Bill Galvin's resignation, or who else? We called for most people's resignation, but certainly Bill Galvin's resignation. UUK have never done anything of the kind because they prefer to try it through sort of polite diplomacy. At some point, they may realise that polite diplomacy just has got them nowhere. I would hope they'll realise it pretty soon, and this is almost a key argument. So I've seen some discussion of, okay, so if the employers are essentially with us, we can't strike against them, can we? Because it's USS that are the bad guys. What good would strike action do? And for me, the argument here is UCU have done pretty much everything we can think of to try and influence this dispute. We've tried. We started years ago with kind of trying to get discussions around the methodology of the valuation, and people were slow to listen to us. Over the last year, so eventually we ended up striking. But then even since the strike action, who was writing submissions to the joint expert panel and helping them to kind of inform their view? It's UCU members doing all that. Then there was this stuff about Test 1 and the numbers we forced out of USS 6 months ago. UK weren't really backing us on that, they were just watching. If it gets to the point where contributions are too high to mean there's a solution to the dispute, we're well within our rights to strike again, because the employers have sat on the fence as long as possible, just about come round to the joint expert panel being the solution, but then aren't prepared to force USS to implement the joint expert panel's recommendations. They could and should be doing a lot more. They're prepared. They're happy doing it through diplomacy, but if that doesn't work, it's their fault. They need to do more.
But the point is right, that there's a lot of background noise created by these additional contributions. There was a person over here.
I was debating with Vicky whether to show a page from some confidential papers. The problem is, papers that we're given all have restricted business sensitive on the top, and we're told that means we can't share them. The page that I would love to show, but I won't because it's being filmed and this is an open meeting and could get me into trouble, is a paper that was written by members of the USS in-house executive team, so the officials who work for USS, to go to the trustee board to aid their decision making on what to do on the 2018 valuation. And there they took each of the joint expert panel's recommendations in turn, and there was a table that said accept, accept, reject, accept, reject, accept. 1 or 2 sentence reasons for why these things were rejected. In one case, so there's one recommendation that was to delay de-risking for 10 years. Now, I'm not going to go into the full details of what that meant, but those who got heavily involved last year will remember about this de-risking plan. If you delay the de-risking, it actually helps the financial position of the scheme. So delay that for 10 years was the recommendation. The reason given for rejecting that, so this is a reason from the executive to the board as a recommendation, was that in fact this fund is too big to de-risk quickly. So rather than waiting 10 years and de-risk over 10 years, they had to start now and de-risk over 20 years. That was the reason that was given. Now that contradicts what USS were planning in September 2017, where they planned a 10-year delay and then a 10-year de-risking. And at that point, it didn't seem to be a problem that this fund was too big to de-risk over 10 years. They thought it was fine. So it's a totally spurious reason there. Now, the other reason we've been given is one that comes down to this thing that Mark was talking about with the pensions regulator, which is USS measure their valuation or talk about how risky their valuation is by reference to the gilt rate. They talk about the valuation on a gilts plus basis. And they said, the other thing they said in that paper was adopting all of the Joint Expert Panel recommendations would send the discount rate to gilts plus 1.66, which they said is above the level that the regulator would tolerate. And they talked about 1.4 as a gilts plus 1.4 as a limit. Now, this is getting technical, but the key point is that USS claimed that gilts plus 1.6 was too high for the regulator. What the regulator said recently in an annual statement on funding of defined benefit schemes was, we do not have any internal benchmarks on a gilts plus basis for how risky the valuation should be, which seemed to contradict the only reason left standing as to why these Joint Expert Panel recommendations couldn't be applied. So the reasoning is flimsy, but the way decision making in these large organisations work is the board meets once every couple of months for a few hours. They have various things on their agenda. They get a paper from their advisors saying, reject these two, accept these four, and unless there's someone really clued up and fighting hard, people go with what they're advised. But I should say that UCU do have some trustees, or at least one trustee, fighting very hard and doing a good job.
Vicky, you had a question?
Yeah, I'm trying to think of the best way to phrase the question. You talked about the employers being in a space which is very different to the way that we were presented with before we had the strike last year. But I'm quite interested in what sense you get of the dynamics within Universities UK, because we saw during the dispute that some senior teams in some universities were more open to the kind of critique that you put out there and others put out there than others. Now, we're in an institution where there wasn't an awful lot of receptiveness to discussing those matters. We don't have the kind of joint working group that you have at Sheffield, at Leeds, despite having asked for something like that. And when we have discussed it, it's been made very clear to us that it wouldn't be the same sort of shape of working group as you have at Sheffield. And I just wonder, because you were talking about how we would absolutely be justified in going on strike if we get to that point with this round. What's your sense of how fragmented? Is it better than it was? Is it the same as it was? Is there movement towards that slightly more positive UK position overall? Because the kinds of conversations we're having here are quite different, I think, to the kinds of conversations that you're having at Sheffield.
Well, I don't know. I don't know for sure. I mean, what we know is what universities say when they respond to the consultations from Universities UK. And I mean, Universities UK have summarised the responses, which, I mean, there's widespread support for the Joint Expert Panel is what universities are saying. Now, it doesn't necessarily mean that underneath, once all this has died away, some of them will revert back to type. But I think employers have shifted quite a lot. I mean, one thing is I think they're much better informed than they were on this stuff. I think a lot of what happened over the last couple of years came down to people who were just happy to accept that what they were told without questioning, and were turning, they were just not listening to what the union was saying, and now they're listening a lot more than they were. Some more than others. You're right. Sheffield has we've managed to drag a long way into thinking about this properly, and I think they would say they've benefited from it. I mean, if universities are looking for a way to make sure this doesn't head into dispute territory at all, then they need to form these working groups and start talking to the staff about it. It seems like a no-brainer, really. So it's a shame that Leeds are resisting. Let's hope they think again.
For me, that seems like a really crucial question, because my huge fear is this, which I guess is an elephant in the room, which is the recent ballot, or should I say turnout.
Oh, on the pay.
Yes.
Yeah. Well, I don't know. I mean, informally, it was disappointing that we didn't get the turnout nationally on the ballot. I seem to remember on the locally aggregated one, I think in Sheffield we just crossed the threshold by about 3 votes. I think you just missed it by a similar number or something, didn't you? Yeah. So anyway, there were plenty of branches that almost got there or did get there. Nationally, yeah, we ended up a fair way off. But I do know that there were people saying, I'm not prepared to strike over this until the pensions pensions are sorted, almost saying I'm reserving my strike action for pensions. And I mean, there was a big discrepancy between the turnout for the pensions dispute and the pay dispute. It obviously will depend on how big an impact that how this thing turns into. So if we end up at this 33.7% rate, all of a sudden there'll be, my guess is that will inflame everything, and there'll be plenty of people prepared to strike. If it's a dispute over who takes the trigger contributions, it's hard to know which way that one would go, and I've got no idea really. It would be interesting to see how the discussion would go in that situation, because I think a lot of people are furious that we had this joint expert panel which gave us a solution which has just been ignored. At the same time, are they furious enough to strike over a possible extra sort of 0.2% over 3 years, or it's not clear. It's not clear.
Before we take this other question, Vicky, you wanted to respond to this?
Just about your point, because I think it's right that we are concerned that we didn't get over the threshold over the pay dispute, but I think there are several things that we need to bear in mind. One is that the pay and equality dispute, that was something like 147 branches, whereas USS is something like 65, I think, or 60 something. And when we had the first set of results, you could see a pattern of much higher turnout in the branches that have been active over USS in the past year. But also that our turnout, if you look at our historic turnout over pay and equality, it was actually quite high. It was one of the highest for that type of dispute. Now, that tells us other problems that we've got within the union about the kinds of conversations that we need to be having with each other over pay and equality disputes and how that joint negotiating works at that national level. But I don't think it's a straightforward relationship between, oh dear, we missed the turnout on this, and that means that we won't make it if we have to ballot again over USS. And I think there are all kinds of different sets of reasons that people had. And one of the things we would like to do, we're having an open, what is usually a reps meeting, but we're opening up more broadly than that in May, where we're inviting people to come and talk to us about whether or not they voted, why they did or didn't, what they think we should be doing in future, that kind of thing. So just, we haven't ignored that elephant, is what I wanted to say.
I mean, I'm always an optimist about this kind of thing, but I kind of hope that this dispute won't need any more strike action. The most likely outcome is a sort of an insistence on these trigger contributions, and that we would certainly have a good go at trying to get the chair to vote with us at the joint negotiating committee that we wouldn't have to pay them. I mean, the point still stands that was made about the fact that, well, then employers still have to pay them, and that could have an impact. But at the same time, for this dispute, that probably would lead to something like a dispute that wouldn't involve any further strike action. But it's all up to members, is the point, and people should be asked what they think. I would always advise people, if there's a strike ballot and a clear steer from the National Union that we need people to vote yes, then at that situation, please vote yes. I mean, it's one of these situations where sometimes people being prepared to strike is enough, and you never have to actually do the striking. I mean, we've seen that in notable local disputes. I forget where Leicester did that in September. Have you done it here in Leeds? I forget. Liverpool had a similar story. Anyway, let's hope there's no need for any more actual strike action over USS this time.
Okay, we've got time for maybe a couple more questions. It comes down to the dynamics of who's involved where. So the negotiator's job, I'm a negotiator, the negotiator's job is to negotiate and try and come up with the best solution through negotiation. And at some point we'll say it's impossible to shift them any further than this. There's the National Dispute Committee, which was formed after the strike action, which has representatives from regions and stuff on it. Their job is to decide what to do as a response to what comes out of the negotiations. And then ultimately, it's for the members to decide whether to strike or whatever. The kind of discussions we have with employers are when it comes to stuff like this,
is to say, why are you unnecessarily inflaming the situation by telling us that you need to share trigger contributions? All the time we're talking to them about the executive of USS, there's a huge problem here, what are you going to do about it? You're going to join us in calling for the resignation of these people. So these kind of conversations are what go on. But no, I don't think there would be any agreement to paying 29 point something plus trigger contributions from UCU. That's not the, we would never be voting in favour of such a thing, in some sense. The question is whether if that's the outcome from negotiations and we can't do any more by using reason, argument and persuasion, then our job is kind of done and it's back to someone else to decide what to do next. Back to Vicky. Vicky will be chairing the HEC, who will make the ultimate decision on these kind of things in the next year, I guess, from June onwards.
No pressure.
Okay, it's coming to 5-2, so maybe we've only got time for one more question, I think.
Right. Yeah. Well, there's quite a small sample size. I think there's been 2 votes in the last sort of 7 or 8 years, which have gone with a casting vote. And maybe I'm being unnecessarily optimistic or overly optimistic or something. But my experience. So the chair of the Joint Negotiating Committee is someone called Andrew Cuby. My experience of having been on the committee since last summer. Now we haven't had any formal votes, so I've never been able to test which way he's going to vote. But of all the people involved, he seems to be doing his job entirely fairly, and sort of, if you're looking for someone acting independently and responding to evidence, my experience of him so far is that's how he views his role, and he does it. Now I don't know why he sided with the employers twice. It could be to do with the dynamics of how the meetings were going on at that time. I mean, it could have been that he was put in a difficult situation with proposals. I mean, it doesn't look good from the outside, but I don't know what it looked like from the inside. I'm hopeful that if we put down the only argument employers have got for sharing the trigger contributions is by framing this 33.7% rate as the proper rate, and then talking about anything lower as a rebate, and then they're like, well, if you're given a rebate, then you've got to pay it back if it stops occurring. That's the only argument they've got. Whereas so I've started working on a document that's got 6 or 7, 8 reasons why these shouldn't be shared. I'm hopeful that we could get the vote of the chair on that, but maybe I'm overly optimistic.
Okay, I think we'll need to bring it to a close now because we're coming to the end of the time in this lecture there. So if you could thank Sam for coming all the way from Sheffield.